There's a family you've never heard of, but they made the Sacklers look like amateurs. If the Sacklers addicted America, these people addicted half the planet and got knighted for it. Picture this. On one side, you have the Sacklers, billionaires behind OxyContin, a drug that killed hundreds of thousands and made them over $20 billion. On the other side, a century earlier, there was another dynasty that used the same playbook. The only difference? Their product wasn't a pill. It was opium. And instead of facing trials, they were celebrated by kings. They didn't just sell addiction, they industrialized it. Before Big Pharma, before corporate lobbying, there was the British East India Company, the world's first mega-corporation. It wasn't just a company, it was Amazon, the Pentagon, and the Federal Reserve rolled into one. At its height, it ruled over 260 million people, more than the US government today. It had its own army, its own currency, its own laws. Imagine one corporation that could print money, declare wars, and control half the world's trade routes. That wasn't science fiction. That was the British Empire's business model. But even empires can go broke. By the 1830s, Britain was bleeding silver buying tea from China. Every cup poured in London meant more silver flowing east. The empire needed a fix, a new source of cash to stop the bleeding. And that's when one man saw opportunity inside a crisis. A Jewish refugee fled persecution in Baghdad and arrived in Bombay with almost nothing but his name, David Sassoon. He watched as Britain's most powerful company struggled to keep its empire alive, and he understood something no one else did. When nations are desperate, they'll turn a blind eye to anything that makes them money. His business wasn't war, it was addiction. And within a few decades, it would reshape Asia, enrich an empire, and destroy a civilization. This story will make you look at history and medicine very differently. In the 1800s, Britain had one national obsession: Chinese tea. It wasn't just a drink, it was a ritual, a national identity, a daily necessity. Every morning, British families poured boiling water over delicate Chinese leaves, never realizing each cup was slowly draining their empire's wealth. Because here's the problem. China didn't want anything from Britain. No wool, no machines, no trinkets from the Industrial Revolution. The only payment they accepted was silver. Every shipment of tea that left Canton meant British ships coming home lighter, not in cargo, but in coins. Every cup of tea in Britain was basically liquid silver leaving the country. Think about that. Imagine your bank account bleeding millions every single year, and every sip you take makes it worse. That's what was happening to Britain. The empire was losing roughly $8 million worth of silver annually, a massive hole in their balance sheet. And for a nation that believed profit was power, this was unacceptable. So what do when your addiction starts bankrupting you? You find a cheaper addiction to sell. And that's exactly what Britain did. They came up with the dirtiest fix in economic history. The plan was elegant and monstrous at the same time. Grow opium in India, sell it to China, take the silver from China, and use it to buy tea. Bring the tea home, sell it to the British public, and repeat. The British called it trade, but in reality, it was a system of addiction disguised as commerce. It formed what economists now call the trade triangle, a closed loop of profit and poison. One corner was India, where the poppy fields stretched endlessly under the sun. Another was China, where millions became addicted to the drug that flowed in through smugglers and ships. And the final corner was Britain, where citizens sipped their tea without realizing it was financed by human suffering. The silver that once bled out of London now flowed back in torrents. So why would a so-called civilized empire poison another nation? Simple. It was cheaper than losing money. The same empire that preached morality and Christianity to the world had turned addiction into policy. And with every new shipment of opium, the British East India Company filled its vaults and emptied China's strength. To make it simple, imagine selling cigarettes to your neighbor just so you can afford his coffee. You get your caffeine, he gets cancer, and you call it good business. That was the British solution. This wasn't just trade. It was a moral implosion disguised as strategy. What started as a desperate attempt to fix a financial deficit became the foundation of an empire's economy and the beginning of China's collapse. Britain saved its balance sheet, but it did it by lighting a fire that would burn across Asia for generations. That triangle, tea, silver, and opium, became the backbone of British profit and the blueprint of a global addiction machine that never really ended. David Sassoon wasn't a kingpin. He was a refugee, a man forced to flee Baghdad in the early 1800s after his family fell out of favor with the ruling powers. He left everything behind, his fortune, his influence, even his home, carrying nothing but his family, his faith, and a relentless instinct for survival. When most men would have hidden or begged for protection, Sassoon looked outward. He boarded a ship bound for Bombay, a city that, at the time, was chaotic, booming, and full of opportunity for those who could read the moment. When he arrived, India was the empire's factory floor. The British East India Company ran everything: the ports, the land, the trade routes. But the system was starting to crack. The company could grow opium in Bengal, yes, but it couldn't distribute it efficiently without getting its hands dirty. The Chinese market was technically closed. Smuggling was rampant. Corruption was everywhere. Britain wanted the profits of addiction without the scandal of running the trade themselves. That's where David Sassoon saw his opening. Where the British saw a moral and logistical nightmare, he saw a business model. He didn't just join the trade, he rebuilt it from the ground up. Sassoon created a system so efficient, it turned human weakness into a supply chain. He set up offices across the coastlines: Bombay, Calcutta, Hong Kong, Shanghai. His network stretched like veins through the empire. But here's what made him different. He didn't rely on others. He owned everything: the farms that grew the poppy, the warehouses that stored the raw opium, the ships that carried it to China, even the insurance companies that protected the cargo from pirates and storms. Every step of the trade passed through his hands, and every coin passed through his books. Think of it like Amazon, but for drugs. A one-man logistics empire where every click, every sale, every craving fed back into his fortune. And the empire loved him for it. Because while his ships smuggled death into China, his ledgers poured silver back into Britain. By the 1850s, the Sassoon family controlled nearly 70% of Asia's opium trade. 70%. To put that into perspective, that's like a single company today controlling almost the entire global pharmaceutical market, with government approval. But this wasn't just about business. It was about trust. And in the 19th century, trust was worth more than gold. Contracts could be broken, paper could be forged, but a man's reputation? That was unshakable currency. And Sassoon built his empire on that. His network of Jewish merchants, traders, and financiers spanned continents. They didn't need signatures or banks. Their word was enough to move millions across borders. When the British Empire needed someone they could rely on, someone discreet and efficient, they turned to Sassoon. He became the perfect middleman. Moral distance for the empire, pure profit for himself. Britain could keep its hands clean, while he did the dirty work. They called it trade. He called it business. And in the end, everyone got what they wanted, except China. What made David Sassoon so dangerous wasn't his ruthlessness. It was his intelligence. He didn't see the trade as crime or conquest. He saw it as math, inputs, outputs, margins, and flows. To him, opium wasn't poison. It was product. People weren't addicts. They were customers. He turned vice into infrastructure, a machine that made money every second of every day, across 3 continents. And maybe the most unsettling part? He didn't seem to see himself as evil. In his mind, he was just solving a problem the empire didn't want to face. He was the fixer behind the throne, the man who made global addiction look like respectable commerce. By the time the first Opium War began, Sassoon's wealth had exploded. His ships dominated Asian waters. His family name became synonymous with influence. While soldiers fought and cities burned, his business boomed. War, to him, was just another market expansion. The British army opened ports. Sassoon's ships filled them. He started as a refugee. He became a kingmaker. The British Empire owed him. The Indian economy relied on him, and the Chinese people suffered because of him. And the genius of it all? He never fired a shot. He didn't conquer nations. He supplied them. So how does a man go from fugitive to financier of empires? Step 1. Own everything. Step 2. Make sure no one blames you. If stories like this make you see money differently, hit subscribe, because these are the histories they don't teach you in school. The ones where morality is optional, profit is sacred, and the smartest men in the room aren't always the heroes. China finally had enough. After years of watching its people waste away under a foreign drug trade, one man decided to take a stand. His name was Lin Zexu, a scholar, a governor, and the kind of official who still believed that morality could hold back greed. In 1839, he surrounded the port of Canton, the heart of the opium trade, and ordered every ounce of the poison destroyed. Over 1,400 tons of opium, millions of pounds, seized and dumped into the sea. Imagine that scene. Soldiers in long robes, crates cracking open, the black tar spilling into the waves like ink. The ocean itself turned bitter that day. To the Chinese, it was an act of moral courage, a nation finally saying, no more. But to the British Empire, it was an act of economic war. Because that opium wasn't just a drug, it was profit, 14% of India's entire revenue. And one man's moral conviction had just wiped billions from their balance sheets. Lin Zexu didn't stop at action. He sent a message. A letter written to Queen Victoria herself. In it, he asked a question that cut through centuries. Why is it moral to poison the Chinese, but not your own people? It was a challenge to conscience, a plea from one ruler to another to recognize the humanity in her victims. But the letter was never answered. The Queen didn't reply. The merchants didn't stop. And the empire, the same empire that claimed to stand for civilization, chose war over morality. Because Britain didn't go to war for pride. It went to war for profit. When morality threatened the bottom line, they sent gunboats. When their drug dealers were punished, they sent soldiers to protect trade. The logic was simple. Protect what pays. The same logic that drives modern lobbying. The same logic that builds empires from addiction today. Only the weapons have changed. From cannons to commercials. The first Opium War began not with ideology, but with invoices. British warships shelled Chinese forts, burned villages, and demanded free trade in poison. Cities crumbled. Millions of lives were lost, not in battle, but in the quiet death of addiction. By 1842, China was broken. The Treaty of Nanking forced it to pay massive reparations, open up ports to British merchants, and hand over Hong Kong, all in exchange for peace. Opium became legal. Addiction became GDP. Picture this. Coastal cities where fathers smoked themselves into oblivion while their children begged for food, rivers filled with bodies, entire villages hollowed out by the same drug that made the Sassoons rich and kept Britain's empire afloat. That's what trade balance looked like. Wealth on one side of the ocean, ruin on the other. And the empire celebrated. London's docks overflowed with tea and silk. Investors toasted record profits. Newspapers praised victory. No one printed Lin Zexu's question again. The moral cost was erased by the ink of financial reports. Here's the bitter truth. Britain didn't win a war. It won a monopoly on misery. The Second Opium War followed just a few years later, driven by the same greed. More ships, more treaties, more humiliation. By 1860, China wasn't just addicted, it was enslaved by economics. Western powers carved it up like a marketplace. Every port became a wound, every treaty another cut into its sovereignty. And through it all, the Sassoons watched their profits soar. For them, war wasn't tragedy. It was opportunity. Every new treaty meant more open ports, more customers, more silver. Their warehouses overflowed, their ships sailed freely, and their name became legend among British elites. The empire got drunk on profit. The Sassoons built palaces. And China, a civilization thousands of years old, drowned in smoke. Pause for a second and think about that imbalance. One family's wealth built on another nation's suffering. One empire's progress paid for by millions of human lives. It's not just history, it's a mirror. Because when a government wages war for commerce, when a corporation profits from addiction, when morality becomes optional, the story always ends the same way. A few get richer, the rest get ruined. The sea that swallowed Lin Zexu's opium was meant to wash the poison away. Instead, it carried the stain across the world. And in that stain, you can still see the reflection of every empire that came after. The British didn't just create global trade, they created a template, how to turn pain into policy, morality into marketing, and suffering into a system. And while the cannons fell silent, the addiction machine never stopped. Because behind every empire's success, there's always a product. And behind every product, there's always a price. The Opium Wars weren't just about drugs. They were about human greed, dressed in the language of free trade. And as Britain celebrated victory, David Sassoon's fortune doubled. His family name was carved into libraries and docks. The empire's debts were paid in silver, and China's soul was left in ashes. War may have opened the ports, but addiction kept them running. After fortune comes guilt, and guilt, when it's rich enough, always buys good PR. By the 1850s, David Sassoon was one of the wealthiest men in the British Empire. But wealth built on addiction casts a long shadow. So he did what every powerful man with a guilty conscience eventually does. He started donating. Docks, schools, libraries, all built with opium money. In Bombay, where his empire was headquartered, the Sassoon name became a symbol of generosity. He built the David Sassoon Library in 1847, marble floors, arched windows, a sanctuary of learning for the British elite. He built the Sassoon Dock in 1861, a sprawling commercial port that brought trade, jobs, and prestige to the city. Both still stand today, admired by tourists and locals alike. The irony? Every brick of those buildings was paid for by suffering halfway across the sea. In India, people saw a philanthropist, a man giving back to the community. But in China, his name was whispered with hatred. To them, he wasn't a benefactor. He was a death merchant. For every child who studied under the roof of his library, there was another child in Canton who starved while their father smoked himself to death. The same money that funded education in one nation was funding destruction in another. And yet, the empire adored him. The British loved men who made money, especially when that money flowed back into their colonies. In 1853, David Sassoon was appointed Sheriff of Bombay, a title of respectability. It didn't matter that his fortune came from narcotics. What mattered was that his donations built monuments, proof that the empire was civilizing its territories. When David died, his son Albert Sassoon took the family's reputation even further. He adopted English customs, mingled with British nobility, and was eventually knighted by Queen Victoria as Knight Commander of the Order of the Star of India. A royal seal of approval on a family fortune soaked in opium. They didn't clean their money. They cleaned their names. They didn't hide their crimes. They put them on plaques. It's a formula as old as empire itself. Destroy with one hand, donate with the other. The Sassoons perfected it. Their wealth didn't just buy property. It bought forgiveness. And soon, the same empire that had once needed their opium began celebrating their legacy. Their portraits hung in museums. Their family name was engraved in libraries. Their history was rewritten, not as smugglers or dealers, but as builders of modern India. Sound familiar? It should, because that rinse cycle never stopped. Today, oil billionaires fund climate labs, and tech moguls fund privacy research. The same corporations that burn the planet now sponsor green energy initiatives. The same companies that exploit your data now hold conferences about digital ethics. It's the same playbook, just with better branding, new logos, same stains. When the Sackler family donated to art museums and universities in the 2000s, everyone praised their generosity. Until the truth came out, their billions came from OxyContin, the opioid that addicted America. Suddenly, the Sackler name started disappearing from museum walls. But here's the twist. The Sassoon name never disappeared. Their monuments still stand, clean and beautiful, because time has a way of bleaching memory. And that's the thing about history. It forgets fast when the buildings are pretty. Walk through Mumbai today, and you'll still see the Sassoon Library, sunlight pouring through its stained glass windows. Students read quietly inside, never realizing they're sitting in a monument funded by a drug that destroyed millions of lives. Outside, the Sassoon dock still bustles with trade. Fishermen haul their catch over stones bought with silver stolen from China. It's a perfect metaphor for empire. The front looks noble, the foundation is rotten, and it's still happening. Different industries, different faces, but the same moral equation. Make billions from damage, then buy your way into heaven one donation at a time. So, what do you think? Respectable or responsible? Which one does history remember? Drop your word below. Because the only reason these stories fade is when people stop calling them what they are. A century later, the same playbook returned. Only the drug changed. The faces were different, the packaging more polished, but the core idea stayed exactly the same. Turn pain into profit and call it progress. The Sassoons sold opium to Asia. The Sacklers sold painkillers to America. Both claimed they were helping people. Both built empires on addiction. Meet the Sackler family, founders of Purdue Pharma, the company behind OxyContin. Their story didn't begin in war or colonial trade. It began in hospitals, TV ads, and doctors' offices. They told America their new drug was safe. Less than 1% risk of addiction, their marketing said. It sounded like hope, especially to millions suffering from chronic pain. But that hope turned out to be one of the most devastating lies in modern history. By the time the truth came out, more than 500,000 Americans were dead. Entire towns in Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky had been hollowed out. Babies were born dependent on opioids. Parents overdosed in their cars, in grocery store parking lots, even during family dinners. The Sacklers didn't just sell painkillers, they sold trust, and they sold it with a smile. The parallels are eerie. The Sassoons made the East addicted to opium under the flag of the British Empire. The Sacklers made the West addicted to opioids under the banner of modern medicine. Different drugs, same profits. The Sassoons called it trade. The Sacklers called it healthcare. Here's the scale of it. In 2023, Americans spent over $600 billion on prescription drugs. That's double what they spent 10 years ago. 1 in 4 Americans takes 4 or more pills every single day. Think about that. 4 pills every day. For stress, for sleep, for cholesterol, for what the first pills caused. And behind every bottle, there's a company counting the money. Big Pharma doesn't make money from curing you. It makes money from keeping you on the hook. Modern medicine, at least the corporate kind, doesn't fix you. It manages you. It turns patients into subscribers. Every refill, every dosage increase, every checkup is another automatic payment in the system. The same logic that fueled the British Empire now runs through the veins of modern healthcare. Find a dependency, scale it, legalize it, and build your wealth around it. It's not about healing anymore. It's about managing symptoms indefinitely. Because the longer you need the product, the more predictable the profits. Sound familiar? That's because it's the same triangle that once connected India, China, and Britain, just updated for the digital age. Back then, it was opium, silver, tea. Today, it's pain, pills, profit. Different era, same equation. And the brilliance, or evil genius of it all, is how invisible it feels now. You don't see ships or smugglers. You see pharmacies, commercials, and friendly faces in lab coats. You see words like health, wellness, care. But the numbers tell a darker truth. In 2023, the top 5 U.S. pharmaceutical companies reported combined revenues of over $1.2 trillion. That's larger than the GDP of most countries. And much of that money comes from long-term, recurring prescriptions. Pills designed not to end pain, but to maintain it at a manageable, profitable level. They didn't fix the pain. As one investigative journalist said, they monetized it. You can see the same cycle of denial and justification the Sassoons used 200 years ago. When critics accused the Sacklers of fueling addiction, they pointed to their philanthropy. Sound familiar? They donated to museums, universities, and hospitals, the very places that treated their victims. Just like David Sassoon built libraries and docks, the Sacklers built entire museum wings. One family funded addiction, the other funded art. Both bought respect. And here's the kicker. Those museums carried their name proudly. The Sackler Wing at the Met, the Sackler Courtyard at the Victoria and Albert Museum. It wasn't until protests erupted in the 2010s that their name began quietly disappearing from walls. But by then, the money had already done its job. That's the modern rinse cycle. Make billions from harm, then buy forgiveness through donations. Oil billionaires fund climate labs. Tech moguls fund privacy research. The pattern never ends. It just updates itself with better branding. What the Sassoons did with ships and silver, Big Pharma now does with labs and lawsuits. The machinery of addiction got smarter, cleaner, and legally bulletproof. Today's drug lords wear suits, sit on corporate boards, and testify in Congress. They don't need to smuggle anything. They just file paperwork. And the scale is staggering. The U.S. alone consumes over 80% of the world's opioids. One nation, 5% of the world's population, takes 80% of its painkillers. Think about what that says. Not just about medicine, but about the state of a civilization that needs that much chemical relief to function. It's not just a health crisis. It's an emotional one, a financial one, a cultural one. Because behind every pill bottle is the same ancient formula. Take something painful, promise relief, and charge for it until the pain becomes permanent. It's easy to think, that was then, we're smarter now. But are we? The British justified opium because it kept the empire rich. We justify overprescribing because it keeps the economy stable. Entire industries, insurance, healthcare, pharmaceuticals, depend on us staying just sick enough to need help, but not enough to die too quickly. And when you zoom out, you see the same triangle again, a modern trade loop of dependency, patients, corporations, and governments. Patients buy the drugs, corporations collect the money, governments take the taxes and look away. They call it public health, you could say. The Sassoons called it trade. It's all the same story. Addiction disguised as duty, profit disguised as progress. You might think we've evolved past the moral blindness of the 1800s, but every generation has its version of opium. The Sassoons had poppies. The Sacklers had OxyContin. Today we have smartphones, streaming, dopamine, and debt. Different drugs, same dependence. The empire isn't a place anymore. It's a system, one that runs on attention, consumption, and quiet addiction. So next time someone says history doesn't repeat itself, remember this. Sometimes it doesn't need to. It just rebrands. And if this story feels too familiar, that's the point. Because the line between trade and tragedy has always been thin. So what's the pattern here? Why does history keep repeating itself every century? Maybe it's time to stop calling it coincidence and start calling it design. Let's break the code. The 5D formula that every empire of addiction follows. Every empire collapses the same way. It's a 5-step addiction loop. You can change the faces, the technology, the slogans, but the pattern never dies. It's history's cruel little joke. The smarter we get, the faster we repeat it. Let's break it down. The 5D formula of empires. Deficit. Every collapse starts with a hole in the balance sheet. Rome began debasing its silver coins, stretching metal to cover its endless wars. Britain bled silver buying Chinese tea, watching its treasure flow east like water. And today, America drowns in debt, trillions printed, interest climbing, the dollar quietly weakening. Every empire starts with the same problem, spending more than it earns. That's when desperation sets in, and desperation always breeds invention. Drug. To fix the deficit, they find something addictive that pays. For the British, it was opium. For the Sacklers, it was OxyContin. For us, it's dopamine. Endless scrolling, consumer debt, the promise of comfort at a cost. Whether it's poppies or pixels, the goal's the same: sell relief. And when people crave what you're selling, your economy becomes bulletproof. At least for a while. Dependence. Once the addiction starts paying, it becomes policy. The British taxed opium to fund their empire. Modern governments rely on consumer spending to keep GDP alive. People can't stop buying, and leaders can't afford for them to stop. It's a feedback loop, dependence on both sides. The public depends on comfort. The system depends on consumption. The machine feeds itself. Donation. Then comes the guilt, or, more accurately, the PR phase. The empire tries to buy forgiveness with generosity. The Sassoons built docks, schools, and libraries from opium profits. The Sacklers built museums and medical research centers from painkillers. Today's billionaires build climate labs after drilling oil, or donate to mental health foundations after engineering addictive social media apps. They don't clean their money, they clean their image. It's the same rinse cycle: new logo, same stain, dissolve, and finally, the overdose. Every empire eventually chokes on its own product. Rome collapsed under inflation and luxury. Britain's empire imploded under the weight of the very colonies it addicted. America's opioid crisis is still unfolding. But it's not the only one. There's the crisis of attention, the crisis of trust, the crisis of meaning. The tools change, the cravings shift, but the ending never does. Every empire that sells pain eventually overdoses on itself. Think about that. The Sassoons built libraries from opium. The Sacklers built museums from painkillers. Both were called benefactors. Both were celebrated for their contributions to civilization. But beneath every marble plaque and every gilded wing lies the same truth. They didn't create wealth. They recycled suffering. And it's not just about drugs. It's about dependency in every form, on comfort, on distraction, on the illusion that someone else will pay the price for our pleasures. But history says otherwise. The bill always comes due. When you look closely, the 5D formula isn't just how empires fall. It's how we live now. Deficit, we spend too much. Drug, we consume what numbs us. Dependence, we call it normal. Donation, we applaud those who built the problem for fixing it. Dissolve, we wonder how it all went wrong. Empires don't explode, they fade. One transaction, one compromise, one moral trade-off at a time. And by the time we realize we're addicted, it's already too late. Every empire that sells pain eventually overdoses on itself. If you want more hidden blueprints like this, the kind of history that still echoes today, hit like. It tells YouTube this kind of truth still matters, because remembering how they fell might be the only way we stop repeating it.